and my best friend, but you're still here, so that's good. So this is a session on course principles then. There have already been two lovely insights into that. Irene just recently from Leeds, and Natalie earlier, Bristol, Ningbo, China. So you've got some sort of grounded insights into particular projects and how people have developed their course principles. Hopefully this will be an insight into the process, and I'm hoping that there'll be something that you take away that maybe you hadn't thought of before. Can I just quickly get a show of hands for those people who already have course principles for your pre-sessional, for your in-sessional, and those who don't? Okay, so there is a mix. There is some on either side. Okay, good. So, jumping straight in then, first question. I've said 3 minutes, but I think I'm going to be generous and give you 2. Why might you have course principles? Why might they matter? What value are they? Grab somebody, 2 minutes, go. Okay. That will probably do. I'm not going to do the TEFL thing and take answers, but here are some of the things that you might have said. So I think one of the values is critical conversation about what you as individuals, as a team, value, what matters across the team. I think it's important as a set of values potentially that can inform things like staff induction, if you have them, staff development, observation, discussions. They can be useful as critical thinking tools, underpinning materials development, or as a way of reviewing, refreshing materials, curriculum design, and so on. They can then act as a site for periodic review over time, enabling you to re-examine the core values, your sense of EAP, your evolving sense of what that is and what it can be, and how far those are actually demonstrated in the course that you run, or the provision that you run. And I think just sort of gesturing to the image on the right, I think it's also a really important lighthouse in the busyness of the everyday, particularly in a context like a UK pre-sessional, where you've got perhaps lots and lots of teachers who don't normally work with you year round, who are coming into the programme just for the summer, and then they have to get to grips with your value system. And if they've been teaching on different pre-sessional programmes, those teachers are sort of coming in and out of quite different approaches potentially, and different flavours of EAP, different course conventions. And so a set of principles can be this sort of guide where, when they're deciding how to orient to your materials, where they're responding to your observation feedback in the classroom, there's a set of clear principles that sort of help them, sort of interpret those things. Hi.
We were talking down here, we identified 2 different types of principles. So Tassos was saying his principles like genre analysis and discourse analysis and so on, which may be more pedagogical. And I was talking about how we've got things like criticality, autonomy, and reflexivity, which are more like what attributes or qualities of the students. I'm just wondering, are you talking about both at the same time, or leaning more to one or the other?
That's a good question. I think at the moment we're talking about both at the same time. So the BAS criteria distinguish, in the context document, the BAS criteria distinguish between your approach to EAP, your principles underpinning assessment, and your principles underpinning pedagogy. And then criterially, in the handbook, the criteria on which people are assessed, it talks about your principles of course design. So potentially in the difference that you made there, you could have one, you could have either, and you could have a mix of both. So in terms of things like reflexivity and autonomy and genre and sort of disciplinary oriented design, you could imagine those being together. Okay, so the key BAS criterion, as I just mentioned then, 1.9, which is in the management and administration section of the criteria. Course is designed according to clearly articulated principles that respond to the target student's academic, language and literacy needs. And then, as I mentioned, in the context document, which you submit a month or 2 before the visit, there are 3 areas that are sort of principles informed: your approach to EAP, to assessment and to pedagogy. I'm going to focus primarily on the top one, which is essentially C1, and we're also going to do a little bit of C3 and make a bit of a distinction between the principles that inform what go onto the page, as it were, in your course, and the principles that inform how teachers lift things off the page in the classroom and make it work for students at point of need. So even if you haven't actually explicitly articulated your course principles, clearly the course that you have does embody a set of values in some way, whether or not you've expressed those explicitly. And so a key thing about developing course principles is teasing it out. It's not the case that you don't have principles because you have a course, and you therefore have principles whether or not you've made those clear. So a really interesting exercise is trying to sort of unearth what those things do. Hence the task. So this is going to get a bit... I've got a few things to give out to you, and I was able to do the first bit during the break. We'll see how the rest goes. So I've deliberately given you something that maybe you don't see on your pre-sessional programs. There's a few pieces of paper around the room. If you don't have one close, I might be able to run and bring one to you. Yeah. Some at the back, maybe. So I've given you a textbook extract deliberately, and there's a template into which you can write if you happen to have a pen. If not, you can just talk about it. So look at the materials in terms of the selection of content and tasks. Look perhaps at the sequencing, the order of the content and the tasks, and then what we might call the pacing. So either the stated or the likely time for each stage. And then briefly, you don't have to do it for the whole thing, but just take a few extracts. The question is, what are the underlying messages that these materials are suggesting about academic writing, EAP? What are the messages here about what is valued in these materials? So what implicit messages are students getting about what matters in this form of EAP? Does that make sense? Okay, have a chat. See if you can articulate those as principles. So, I mean, just to give you one example, if we were looking at something different, and you saw examples of texts where one was in biology and one was in business, and it asked you to do a comparison and then a genre analysis, maybe one of the sort of emerging principles from that is that disciplinary difference matters and that genre matters. Those kinds of principles would come out from material like that. This is different. What is suggested inherently about what matters here? Okay, that might not be long enough, but hopefully that's a few minutes to get started. Again, we're not here to talk about the materials per se and to agree or disagree what the principles are, more to kind of sort of express the point that this as an exercise might be a useful thing to do, right? But here are some things, here are some thoughts, here are some possible things. So it suggests, I think, the materials that essay writing is fairly straightforward. Maybe even there's a correct way to do this or a single way to do this. There's no, or at least no mention of intellectual challenge. And when we think of pre-sessional context even and the kind of work that students are going on to be doing, pre-sessional should perhaps not only be about linguistic challenge, but also intellectual challenge, long readings, conceptually challenging content, to sort of scaffold students into that way of thinking and doing, not just about language learning. There's no sense of that here, really. It's arguably disconnected from reading. So there's lots of talk about writing, but there's no sense about what feeds that. Students in even at undergraduate level in year one are, unless they're doing reflective writing, they're very rarely writing without some form of data or input or reading. Structuring, I mean, again, a sort of underpinning message that structuring is fairly simple and uniform. It's introduction, body, conclusion. Maybe some basic variation in purpose, but otherwise structure doesn't change. Essay structure can be understood from sentence level examples, is the suggestion that is in what we have access to. Disciplinary variation is not important. Student writer criticality and agency, choice, don't appear to be considerations. Here's a template, here's how you write essays of different kinds, end of story. And so if these were your materials, you might then, having done this exercise, having done it with a piece of in-sessional material, pre-sessional material, whatever it might be, having brought out these descriptions of the messages underpinning your materials, you might then ask the question, well, how far do these messages align with what we think we do and what we say we do? What do we tell students? What do we tell our teachers? Is that actually embodied in the materials that we give our students? So some sort of summary sort of interim thoughts then. I think interrogating your course materials in this kind of bottom-up manner, perhaps also your assessments, can potentially be a nice practice-led way of uncovering and articulating principles, importantly, in what you actually do. And one of the sort of overarching messages from today is it can be relatively easy to generate a set of principles in the cloud. What's really important is that, particularly for a BAS assessment, that we see it in practice. So having a notional set of what you think you would like to achieve can be useful for an aspirational view of what you do and for kind of moving forwards and so on. But if there's no match between what you do in your principles and what the materials do and what we see in the classroom, that's sort of problematic. So it's important then that these resonate with what you think you do, or sorry, no, I'm reading my own things wrong. So your principles then may resonate with what you think they do, with what you think you do. But if they don't, then teasing out what you actually do can provoke sort of critical reflection on things that need to change. If your materials do things that you didn't realize they did, and actually if you're sending messages to students, I mean, some of the other messages in those materials are things like short texts are enough, or reading doesn't really matter, and we know that reading does. So if you're only giving your students short extracts of 200-300 word texts for entire summer of pre-sessional, but they're then going on to immediately reading 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 word papers, then the sort of the principles of your program are actually not reflecting what they're going on to do. So it's important for a BAS visit, broadly speaking, that we can see the principles in your practices, that we can see your principles in your practices. Okay, so as has been a thread throughout the day so far, I think, the BAS scheme and the assessors take context very seriously. This is a short extract from the BAS handbook that sort of articulates that quite nicely. EAP, as a practice, finds expressions in a range of contexts, and at the heart of EAP, as understood in the scheme, is dedication to enhancing academic communication ability through the medium of English in a particular context, but how that finds expression can be quite diverse, right? So, Melinda did some work with you earlier on you sort of thinking about your contexts, the affordances of those contexts, the freedoms, the constraints, the challenges, your friends, your not-so-friends. But what I'd like you to do is define EAP for your particular context. So just for 2 minutes, if you think about your own, if we take the arts and design context, is quite a nice one. So in the arts and design context, those students are going on to quite different kinds of programs to the ones that I'm familiar with, for example, where there's lots of oracy, there's lots of critique, there are spoken genres that don't exist in our institution. And so the flavour of EAP at Royal College of Art, for example, is really quite different to the flavour of EAP that we're used to. We're very text-driven, we're very genre-driven, and until recently, the majority of our assessments were very writing-oriented, and that's not the case at the Royal College. So we can go to Highland, we can go to Swales, we can go to Bruce, and we can find a textbook definition of EAP. But what's EAP for you in your context, for your institution, for your students, given your sense of where they're going? So just for 2 minutes. I said 5. I'll give you 2. What's EAP for you and your students, for your course or your provision at this moment, given your sense of what they need and where they're going? Have a chat. Okay. So the reason that I wanted you to think about your EAP for your context briefly is for the next task. So Karen and Melinda have very kindly handed round the next item, the next artifact, which is a set of notional course principles. Well, there's a number of course principles and a number of pedagogic principles. These are invented. These don't come from a real course. They're not a model of best practice or anything, but they're just one articulation of what some principles might look like. You might ask, what approach do you see in the way that these have been articulated? But I think the main thing I'd like you to think about very briefly is, how far do these principles work for your context, your students, your target disciplines, your EAP? What would you change? What would you delete? What's missing? What would you add? So have a look at these and just think critically with respect to your own EAP and your own contexts, what you might do with these. What do you like? What do you not? What would you add? What would you delete? Have a few minutes on that. Okay. So you've had one set of criteria to look at. Those were notional. I've handed round a second criteria, principles. I've sent around a second set of principles. These are actually ours. Again, they're not a model of best practice. It's just because they're ours, it's easy for me to hand them out and share them. And I wasn't organised enough to get consent from lots of other people. So the main thing about these, I've framed these as questions, but I can tell you. So you'll notice. I'll give you a second to read them in a bit, but they're articulated differently from the first set. So hopefully, if you haven't done this before, it just gives you a sense that there can be quite a variation, and legitimately so, in how these get expressed. There's no one way of doing it. There's no right answer. There's not a particular set of principles that the BAS scheme is looking for. It's about your context. It's about your flavour of EAP and how you express what you think matters. Of course, there might be things, and there are often things that resonate and are common across institutions, but it is genuinely a conversation for you to have about what matters in your context for your students and what you think they need. So hopefully it's useful just to see a bit of a comparison. These trace back to our assessment visit in 2016, where we decided that one of the things that we hadn't done, or we realised one of the things that we'd never done, was make our course principles visible to students. So 2016, pre-COVID, we still had hard copy books, and one of the things that we did was put the principles into the student study books at the beginning of their course and say, here's why you do what you do. So we re-articulated all of our principles, which had existed for a few years, in a student-facing way, and so they became part of the management conversation backstage, became a conversation with the teachers at induction, and then ongoing through staff meetings, but it also became something that we encouraged teachers to talk about with students and to sort of help them see a sense of the big picture and why the course was designed in the way that it was. What I've done so these are almost what we had until 2023. In 2023, between 2023 and 24, we decided that we had to respond to AI. And so we made some of the biggest changes to the summer pre-sessional that we've made for quite a long time. For example, we switched the 70-30% weighting in favour of writing assessments to 60-40 in favour of speaking. The final writing was dragged out into a portfolio assessment So students now do an annotated bibliography first, but they're not assessed on the written annotated bibliography, they're assessed on their presentation of it. And then they hand in a draft essay, and they're assessed both on the draft essay, but on their ability to talk about it. And then just before they hand in their final assessment, they're viva'd. And so each student is interviewed on their writing, and they're asked questions like, which reading did you find hardest and why? What ideas didn't go into the essay? What did you consider? What was an alternative perspective that didn't end up in your piece of writing, and things like that. So we did quite a lot of work. And so the shift towards oracy, the shift towards, we put in a critical digital literacies strand in the course as well. And a big theme of that, we realised that there was no point trying to tell students that we could beat AI. So we moved away from the idea of showing them examples of text and then saying, look, it's not very good. ChatGPT is not that good. Because we knew that eventually it would be that good and we would lose that battle. So instead of going down that avenue, we went down an ethics avenue, and we talked about the importance of doing the work yourself. That yes, you can hand in a piece of work that's going to get a grade, but ultimately the higher of higher education is about who you become. It's how the knowledge and your investment with reading and so on shapes you as a person, so that when you go into the world of research or work, you can act in and on the world in ways that you couldn't before you did your degree. So there was a real focus on ethics and the ethics of academic work and so on. And although we talked about plagiarism before, we hadn't really framed it in terms of ethics for the course. And so ethics and oracy particularly became themes, as did, I guess, AI there in the background. And so that then meant that we had to refresh our principles. So for 2024, these are the brand new ones. And what you can see in the highlighting, there's a few principles that teachers fed back on, and we've reworded things as a result. But the others are informed by this shift towards oracy and the shift towards thinking more about ethics. So maybe I'll just shut up. There was a task. Maybe I've just destroyed the task. But I'll give you a couple of minutes to just kind of look at those. They're a different way of doing it. Have a look at the changes, see what you think. Again, you might ask yourself, does this work for our context? Would we do it differently? I'll give you a couple of minutes just to have a look through. Okay, so actually, just to let you know, at the end of the slides, I have a QR code with a link to a folder with all the handouts and the slides from today. So if anybody's interested in taking any of this away, get your phones ready for the end. So I think just one of the things to come out of this then is to sort of consider the kinds of things that might change your principles. What are the forces, internal, whether it's curricular, whether it's staff-based, external, it could be about international student recruitment. I think that is coming our way in Durham. So as with many places elsewhere, the drop in international student numbers means we're fighting for students, which means we are lowering IELTS levels across a number of key departments. That means that we have to lower our entry levels onto pre-sessional, and we're now getting a different kind, or we will be getting this summer for the first time, a different kind of student. So departments will also be receiving lower level students direct entry, and we have benefited, Durham, by being Durham, has benefited quite a lot from a relatively high English language level student because the market was there. Students would come into our pre-sessional with a 6, and so often on a sort of 10-week pre-sessional, we'd have students with nothing under 6. So when you've got nothing under 6, you can do readings, you can do conceptually challenging things, you can have seminars that are discipline invested. When that goes down to 5 and 5.5, it becomes more challenging. Our pre-sessional has been based a lot around macro structure, and we do language, but it tends to come second. So first we tend to focus on text structure, on students reading things, phasing texts, understanding what a literature review looks like, or understanding what a discursive essay looks like, and then we might do some stuff on nominalization or some stuff on common sentence starters in particular parts of the text and so on. I think now there's likely to be a return to far more language work, and language work first up rather than second, and I think the impact on our longer pre-sessional is also going to be more of a focus on language. And so I wonder whether our principles might begin to shift again because of the kinds of students that we're now getting, and how that will change what's possible for us in the classroom. So there are those kind of external factors as well that may begin to impact what's possible for your EAP in your context, and so that then forces an ongoing conversation about what you say you do and what you actually do, and the kinds of conversations you have with staff in observations and so on. So these forces, whether they're internal, external, conceptual, can reshape your sense of best practice, and perhaps therefore the principles as you need to articulate them. So as I think I say in a few slides' time, the principles document should always be seen as a live, agile, ongoing document subject to periodic review. And I suppose particularly for the BAS process, it would make sense that every 4 years we don't see exactly the same principles. Because your EAP evolves, your student body evolves, your sense of what it means to work on academic discourse may evolve as your relationships with departments evolve, as the wider climate evolves, and so you may find, or you should find, that things change with it. So some extra thoughts, maybe I'm repeating myself, but oh no, we didn't really talk about this. We'll come back to it in a second. But I think it's useful to differentiate the principles shaping what goes onto the page, your principles underpinning course design, and then the principles shaping how teachers lift that off. So pedagogic principles are different from curriculum principles. They may overlap. You may have something like authenticity as a principle for your curriculum and also for your pedagogy, but you need to make clear for your teachers how that translates differently. So authenticity for curriculum could be about the kind of texts that you choose, the kind of tasks that you have students engage in, whereas authenticity in the classroom may relate to how the teacher interacts with students live in the room, dealing with who they are, at what point they are, however you want to translate authenticity. So you could use the same term, but how they get enacted in curriculum and classroom may be different. But we'll come back to that in a second. I think I've just made this point. If the principles are high level, if you say that your principles are things like autonomy, reflexivity, make it clear what that means. Make it clear for the BAS assessors in your context document, but also make it clear for your teachers, for your students. How does that actually translate? So reflexivity sounds cool, but what does that look like in teacher practice? What does that look like in your curriculum? Can the teachers see it? So they do need to be principles for your context, but I think they also need to be EAP principles. So if you're espousing communicative language teaching, if you're espousing task-based design, which ostensibly can be quite TEFL-y sounding, just that extra bit of detail to say what that means for an academic discourse context is quite useful for just clarifying how these things are working for you for a university course or provision. And I've made that point. The beliefs and practices and things evolve over time, and so do treat your principles as a live document to review and revise. Okay, did you get final handout? We've just about got time. So this is us looking now. So the first set of principles did actually mix. You had 4 or 5 course principles, 4 or 5 classroom principles. We didn't really talk about the latter. This gives you a comparator for what pedagogic principles might look like. Again, it's not necessarily a model, it's an example. But similarly, as we have done already, maybe have a look at these. How far do these align with what you value in EAP classroom practice in your context? And again, are there any things that you would change or delete? What do you think perhaps is missing What might you add to? You'll notice that these are sort of articulated. These are not student-facing yet, although I suppose there's no reason why they couldn't be, but they are clearly teacher-facing, and we've tried to make them quite accessible and in line with the course principles. But hopefully you can notice the clear distinction between how we're articulating curriculum principles and how we're articulating classroom principles. So have a look at those. Critical eye for your context and your EAP. Would you add, delete, snog, marry, avoid? Okay. So hopefully those are useful, at least as examples. I'm sure you will want to add to those. The last two on that list, the one about being learning-centred over learner-centred, has been a particularly useful one for conversations with teachers about what actually happens in the class, the focus on learning gain rather than just having students be busy. That's been an important one. And I think also the final one about remembering that, particularly in a postgraduate context, that you're not the only expert in the room and that you can draw on your students' disciplinary knowledge and subject knowledge in ways that can genuinely enrich the class. Those have been useful for conversations with staff. Okay, heading towards the end then. If you already have principles, some useful questions to ask might be, particularly in view of a BAS visit, where do they come from? Did you find them, borrow them, steal them? Did you invent them? Did they come from the mind of one person, or are they part of a shared and ongoing conversation? Do they come purely from theory without really a grounding in the context that you're working in? Do they come only from practice? Is there a bit of a mix? Do your principles come from theory-informed practice? And as a result of any of these things, is it useful then to rethink, update, or enrich your approach in some way? If you don't already have principles, here are some questions that might be useful to get you thinking in productive ways. So what do you care about for your context? What does it seek to achieve? Why have you chosen these texts, these tasks, these assessments, and not something else? Why are the tasks, sessions, assessments in this particular order and not in a different order? Why do you spend more time on these things and less time on these things? What does all that say about your views on academic discourse, on student needs, expectations of departments, and what you think is possible in your context? How might it be different? Might different be better, or might that be worse, and why? How can ongoing reading, scholarship, community conversations, either internally or in forums like this, inform your thinking, your practices, your principles? And then, as we briefly talked about, what external and internal forces might force a reconsideration of the kind of things that you might think are your principles. In summary then, particularly for a BAS visit, the principles shouldn't make you anxious. BAS is not testing you. There's not a single correct answer. They should ultimately, I think, represent shared understandings across a team, across a staffing group. So we would encourage you to make it collaborative, draft the principles with colleagues, and both our case studies today from Irene and Natalie are perfect examples of that kind of thing, really kind of large-scale involvement of many people bottom up in articulating what those are. Staying as close as you can to your materials to make sure that there is that interaction between the two. Staff development and scholarship can enable those ideas and the articulation of your principles to evolve, and so a sort of mix of top-down and bottom-up engagement, I think, can be productive. And I think it's important, given some of the things that we see in BAS principles, that we don't need a bibliography. Sometimes the expression of principles looks a little bit performative. You go to Highland, you go to Swales, you go to Bruce, and you pull out your definitions and you say, we do constructive alignment, and we do socio-constructive something or other, and we do genre-based pedagogy, and you sort of pull these things out, and then you don't necessarily see it enacted in the course, and we don't need a bibliography necessarily. I mean, if you want to, of course, and we're endorsing a scholarly approach, but it's not necessary to articulate course principles necessarily in those terms, as you've seen from the examples. Do be aware that, or be careful that if your principles are partly aspirational, that there are sort of clear and transparent moves towards you making those real in your curriculum. It can be good to have aspirational principles because it gives you a sense of where you need to go, but you want to be careful of a mismatch between what you tell your teachers and your students that the course does and what it actually does. I hadn't thought about this until I put the slides together, but consider shaping the principles with your students. We heard from Kevin, I think it was, about sort of student partnerships, or somebody was talking about student partnerships. Perhaps they could help shape the principles. Make sure they're visible, particularly for a BAS visit. Make sure that they're visible, accessible and understood by everyone. And that goes back to the point about it being in the mind of one person. It's important that the teachers understand them. It's important that they understand how they're enacted in the principles and how it shapes your ethos for the course, so that they know what you're expecting in the classroom, in marking and so on. And then finally, as we've said already, do consider building in review. Those principles should be a sort of live, agile and slowly evolving document that develops together with your team. That's it, thank you. And if you do want the materials, they're in that folder. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Does anyone have any questions? Everybody's getting the QR code. Questions or comments? Oh, okay.
Well, this is a comment, really. I was interested, Steve, that you mentioned learning gain as opposed to just the focus on learning, and also it was really interesting seeing the principles that you'd actually developed that were student friendly, and it made me wonder whether you could, at the end of the course, having given the students the principles at the beginning, get them to look at them and reflect on them and see if they felt that they had been enacted and that they understood them more fully at the end and felt that they equipped them in order to go on to their courses. So thank you. It was a lovely idea.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And in fact, I'm no longer really involved in the pre-sessional, but our new pre-sessional head is building in some stuff on reflection, or some extra stuff on reflection this year. And actually that might be a nice way to kind of end the reflections, to have them come back to principles. So I'll pass that on. Yeah, thank you.
Was there a hand up again up there? No. Anyone
I think
else?
it's stretching a yawn.
No. Oh.
I see. Could I ask just one question out of curiosity? The principles you shared with us. Number 5, you did ask us, why do we think you added these new ones? So number 5, you added, we also believe in finding a healthy balance between study, rest and play. I'm wondering what prompted you to add this. Was it something that you observed in a particular cohort of students one summer? Were there any issues with their welfare?
No, I think so. Student welfare on the pre-sessional is always a big concern, and it's always something that we sort of talk about in parallel. And I think just perhaps institutional conversations around things like belonging and well-being and mental health, and I think because those are coming more to the fore, it was just in sort of the front of our minds more than maybe it had been, and we perhaps just looked at those principles and realised that we'd never thought about because there is a well-being side to the academic experience, right? And we know that students come to the other side of the world, and that that experience can be physically challenging and emotionally challenging and psychologically challenging. And increasingly we're seeing international students who present with perhaps it's dyslexia or present with anxiety or other kinds of issues. And so I suppose maybe we just hadn't explicitly made the link between the importance of well-being and the ability to focus in the classroom on the academic side of things. And so it was just an attempt to sort of bring those two things together, I think.
Yeah. Very good, thank you. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much.